Welcome back everybody to our studies in Edexcel GCSE Psychology. This lesson is moving on to topic number 2 in this major series, focusing on the question of memory. And the specification requires us to know the structure and the processes of memory and information processing. So that's what we're going to do in this lesson. And to begin with, let's think about the first stage of memory processing and information processing. This is known as the encoding stage, or the input stage of memory. Encoding is essentially the process through which sensory input is transformed into a form that can be stored in memory. How does the wavelengths of light that hits my retina in my eye, or the wavelengths of sound hitting my earlobe and my eardrum specifically, how do they go from just light or vibrations in the air to becoming information that I can then actually process? The information comes from these sensors then. It comes from various different sensors that we have and then is encoded at the input stage. So you have, for example, visual encoding, which involves the processes of, or the processing of images or visual information. You have acoustic encoding, which involves processing sounds, such as words or music. And you also have semantic encoding. Semantic encoding involves processing the meaning of information, such as understanding a concept or an idea. And so in some cases, you will see that there is an interrelationship between each of these types of encoding. You can have some the visual and semantic encoding operating in a similar sense, because you might be encoding and processing images and visual information, but also trying to understand concepts and ideas associated with that image, with that information that comes from that image. At the encoding stage then, attention plays a very crucial role. Information that receives focused attention is more likely to be encoded successfully. This is why things like multitasking results in poorer encoding and retention of information, because people can't multitask. When you multitask, you are not actually doing two tasks at once. You are just switching from one task to another at a very quick rate. But it is not an effective method for encoding any type of information. And if you want an anecdotal example of that, just try and do your GCSE maths past paper exams for your exams later on. Do some revision for your maths exam while watching TV versus while doing it in silence or doing it with sort of white noise in the background. See the difference, okay? See the difference in how well you're able to focus compared to the example of watching TV or watching a movie at the same time. This is a thing that I've had to reconcile with my entire academic life, because the idea of sitting down in silence and just doing work is something that, again, is very difficult for me to do. So I've had to settle with things like white noise or kind of classical music in the background or things like that to try and allow my brain to actually have something going on while also being able to focus as maximally as possible when thinking about writing and doing other things like this, or making these lessons as well, as it turns out. Once information is encoded then, it is stored in the brain for later retrieval. Memory storage is often categorized into 3 systems. We have sensory memory. This is the first stage of memory, which retains information for a very brief period, often sometimes milliseconds to a few seconds. It allows the brain to capture a snapshot of the sensory input for further processing. We can see that we have iconic memory in this category, which is visual sensory memory, and you also have echoic memory, which is auditory sensory memory. You then have STM, short-term memory. This is sometimes known as working memory, and it holds that information temporarily for up to 30 or so seconds. But it has a limited capacity, often 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, so sort of 7 to between sort of 5 and 9 pieces of information. This memory system is responsible for actively processing and manipulating information. Rehearsal, such as repeating information, helps to retain longer short-term memory. And then we get the storage of long-term memory. This is where information is stored for extended periods, from hours on the sort of lower end of that spectrum to an entire lifetime on the upper end of that spectrum. Long-term memory is essentially limitless in terms of its capacity and is organized based on semantic meaning. The process of encoding into long-term memory often involves elaboration and linking new information to existing knowledge. Consolidation is the process by which encoding information becomes stable in long-term memory. It is a dynamic process, and it can take time, sometimes from hours to days. And it is thought to occur through the reorganization of neural connections, particularly during sleep, which plays a vital role in strengthening and stabilizing memories. Just as a piece of advice for anybody who is studying, you're doing your GCSEs right now, you're studying for these exams, okay, it's sort of exam season, it's May or April, May, June time, and you're looking to go on and do really well in your exams, make sure you get enough sleep. Make sure you eat healthy, make sure you get enough sleep, make sure you get a lot of exercise. Exercise, okay, involves stressing your cardiovascular system, bringing in more oxygen into your bloodstream. That oxygen helps feed the brain. Sleeping helps to develop these neural connections. So on top of the big things that you should be doing, such as just studying for your exams, doing past paper questions mainly, okay, you should also be thinking about those other things as well. Making sure you get plenty of exercise, make sure you reduce stress as much as possible, be as calm and as relaxed as possible, and get as much sleep as humanly possible. Now, that's very easy to say from somebody who no longer has to do exams, but it is vital, okay, and it's a very important part of the process. Retrieval, then, is the process of accessing stored information when it is needed. The brain utilizes retrieval cues, which can be, for example, context-dependent cues, the environment in which the information was learned, so being in the same place where you studied. It could be state-dependent cues, the internal state of the individual, the level of mood or arousal at different points, as well as semantic cues, related concepts and associations that can help you trigger the recall of the target information. How many times have you listened to a song or watched a particular TV show episode that you'd watched before, and then you were all of a sudden reminded of what you were doing at the time you first listened to that song or when you last listened to that song? This is the idea of retrieval and the different cues that can bring about the types of retrieval. Speaking of the types of retrieval, there are two main types of retrieval. The first is recall. This is retrieving information without specific cues. So, for example, answering an essay question. You also have recognition. This is identifying previously encountered information from a set of options, i.e., multiple choice questions. Forgetting occurs when information cannot be retrieved from memory. Several theories have been proposed to attempt to explain why forgetting happens. One example is this idea of decay theory, which suggests that memory traces fade over time if they are not rehearsed or used. The idea that you have to keep on continuously using them, otherwise it will eventually disappear. Interference theory suggests that new information can interfere with the retrieval of older information, sometimes known as retroactive interference, or conversely, older information can interfere with the retrieval of new information. This is known as proactive interference. You also might have cue-dependent forgetting. This occurs when there is an absence of effective cues that can actually trigger the memory retrieval process. Within this whole line of inquiry, then, there are different systems and structures within the brain that help at various different stages of memory. So, for example, the hippocampus is critical for the formation of new memories and the consolidation of long-term memory. It helps to organize and to retrieve stored information. The prefrontal cortex plays a very important role in working memory and executive functions such as attention and decision-making. The amygdala is involved in emotional memory processing and can enhance the encoding of emotionally significant information. The cerebellum is associated with procedural memory, like skills and habits, and motor memory. And then you've got the basal ganglia, which is involved in procedural memory and habit formation. Coming down towards the end of this lesson then, we can see that there are various different types of memory. We can categorize it based on their functions and their time spans. And we've already looked at long-term and short-term and that kind of memory already, but we can define it in different ways as well. So for example, you have what is sometimes known as explicit memory or declarative memory. These are conscious memories that can be verbally described. We will often delineate further deliberative memory into episodic memory, which is memories of personal experience or events. That's the sort of colloquial definition of a memory. I have a memory of what took place when I was younger, for example. But also semantic memory, the idea of factual information and knowledge about the world. By contrast then, implicit or non-declarative memory involves unconscious memories, such as motor skills or habits. These can be, but not limited to, procedural memory, skills and actions that are learned over time, the idea of priming, exposure to one stimuli, and the stimulus influences the response to subsequent stimuli. And then also classical conditioning, learned associations between stimuli. Attention then is critical for memory information and memory formation. Without attention, sensory information is not processed effectively, and this leads to poor encoding, and then by extension, poor retention. The brain's limited attentional capacity means that only a subset of all incoming sensory information will get processed into short-term and then eventually into long-term memory. And then finally, the idea of cognitive load theory refers to the amount of mental effort that is required for processing information. A high cognitive load can negatively impact memory because it overloads the working memory capacity. Conversely, and by contrast, breaking down complexity through breaking down of complex information into manageable chunks has the ability to facilitate memory retention.